Life as a teenager in the Middle Ages was hardly a walk through a field of daisies, though, to be fair, those daisy fields were probably full of manure and the occasional cow bone. Imagine waking up at dawn, not because your mom is yelling that you're late for school, but because a rooster with an impeccable sense of timing decides 4 a.m. is the perfect moment for a concert. That was the natural alarm clock of the era, and there was no snooze button. If you lived in a village, the first thing you did was stretch your legs, scratch the fleas from the night, and put on the same smelly tunic you'd been wearing all week. Hygiene wasn't exactly the Middle Ages' strong suit, and a bath was a luxury that happened maybe once a month, if the river wasn't frozen or crawling with leeches. Being a teenager in those times meant that, at 13 or 14, you were no longer a pampered child but an adult in training, or at least that's what your parents, the feudal lord, and the village priest, who always seemed to have an opinion on everything, expected. If you were the child of peasants, your day began with a frugal breakfast, a hunk of stale bread, maybe a bit of rancid cheese if you were lucky, and watered-down beer, because pure water was suspicious and likely to make you sick. Diarrhea was, let's say, a constant companion, and there were no pharmacies with miracle pills to save you. Then, you slipped on your worn-out leather boots, if you had any, and headed to the fields to work until the sun set or your hands hurt so much you couldn't grip the hoe anymore. Work wasn't optional. It was the difference between eating a crust of bread or slowly starving to death. The field wasn't just a workplace but a battlefield against nature. You had to plow the earth, which seemed harder than a corrupt knight's conscience, sow wheat or barley, and pray for rain, but not too much, because a flood could ruin the crop. And if rain wasn't the problem, then it was locusts, wild boars, or some neighboring noble who decided to burn your fields because your feudal lord owed him money. Life was a constant game of chance, and the odds were never in your favor. If you survived the day without a wolf mistaking you for dinner, you still had to hand over most of your harvest to the feudal lord, who lived in a castle that, compared to your mud and straw hut, looked like a fairy tale palace, though it probably smelled just as bad inside. But it wasn't all sweat and tears. Teenagers had their moments of fun, though fun in the Middle Ages was a bit peculiar. Boys and girls gathered at village festivals, usually centered around some saint or the harvest. There, under the priest's suspicious gaze, they danced to the sound of flutes and drums, though dancing often meant clumsy hopping while trying not to step on your partner's bare feet. Fairs were another escape, with jugglers, troubadours, and peddlers selling trinkets or mysterious meat on a stick. No one asked what animal it came from, because, frankly, hunger didn't let you be picky. Games were popular too. Boys played at fighting with sticks, imagining themselves as knights, while girls, if they had a free moment, might weave or chat about who would marry whom, because marriage was the big life event, and not exactly for love. Speaking of marriage, being a teenager in the Middle Ages meant you were on the starting line for wedlock, and it wasn't always your choice. If you were a girl, your parents were likely already negotiating with the blacksmith's or miller's family to marry you off at 14 or 15. Boys weren't much better off. If you were the eldest, you'd inherit the land, but also the responsibility of supporting the whole family. If you were the youngest, good luck. You might end up as an apprentice to a grumpy craftsman or, if you were brave or desperate, join a band of mercenaries to seek fortune, which often meant seeking an early death. Romantic love was a luxury few could afford. Marriage was a contract, and the goal was to survive together, not to write poems by moonlight, though, to be honest, the moon was probably the only thing lighting your hut at night. Religion was the center of everything, and there was no escaping it. The church was everywhere, literally and figuratively. On Sundays, you dragged yourself to Mass, even though the sermon was in Latin and you didn't understand a word. The priest constantly reminded you that sin was around the corner, and teenagers, with their raging hormones, were easy targets for his warnings. "Beware of lust," he'd shout, while you tried not to stare too long at the baker's daughter or the boy who tended the sheep. Fear of hell was real, and tales of demons, witches, and eternal punishment kept you up at night, though, to be fair, fleas and the cold helped too. If you misbehaved, you risked not just physical punishment, a good thrashing with a stick was standard, but also excommunication, which basically made you a social outcast and doomed your soul. Not that you had much time to sin anyway. Between work, hunger, and exhaustion, the biggest temptation was stealing an extra piece of bread. Health was another minefield. If you made it to adolescence, you were already a survivor, because childhood was like a deadly obstacle course. But being a teenager didn't spare you from danger. Diseases lurked like wolves in the dark. The plague, smallpox, dysentery, and an endless list of nameless fevers. Doctors, if you could call them that, were more like fortune-tellers than healers. If you cut your hand while reaping, the best you could hope for was a herbal poultice and a prayer. If the wound got infected, well, prepare to lose the hand or, worst case, your life. Dentists didn't exist, and if a tooth ached, a barber with a pair of pliers and boundless optimism took care of it, probably leaving you in more pain than before. Life expectancy hovered around 30 or 40, so as a teenager, you were already halfway there, and every day was a gamble. Education, for most, was a distant dream. If you were a village boy, the closest you got to reading was deciphering marks on grain sacks. The sons of nobles and wealthy merchants were luckier. They might be sent to a monastery or cathedral school to learn Latin, grammar, and some math, but that was a privilege for the few. Girls rarely had access, and their education focused on sewing, cooking, and childcare, because medieval society had clear ideas about everyone's roles. Still, it wasn't all grim. Troubadours and fireside stories were a form of learning, and teenagers soaked up tales of knights, dragons, and saints, fueling their imaginations in a world where reality was harsh and predictable. Danger was everywhere, and not just from disease. Wars were constant, and if you lived near a border, you might wake up one day to find your village in flames because some king or baron decided he needed more land. Bandits roamed the roads, and traveling alone was an invitation to be robbed, or worse. Even at home, violence was part of life. Neighborly fights, brutal punishments from feudal lords, and the constant threat of a bad harvest leaving you with nothing. Teenagers, with their energy and impulsiveness, often got into trouble, whether stealing a chicken to impress friends or arguing with a neighbor's son, which could escalate into a family feud lasting generations. Food, or the lack of it, was a constant worry. Hunger was a loyal companion, and winters were especially harsh. If the harvest failed, you faced months of meager rations, and soup was often hot water with a handful of herbs and, if lucky, a bone for flavor. Meat was a luxury, and when it appeared, it was usually tough, salty, or slightly suspect. Teenagers, with their growing bodies, felt the hunger more keenly, and it wasn't uncommon for a boy to sneak into a neighbor's henhouse, risking severe punishment for an egg or two. Yet there were moments of plenty. Harvest festivals, when grain was stored and a pig was slaughtered, were a feast, and for a day or two, you could eat your fill, which was a miracle in itself. Clothing was another challenge. Forget fashion. Most teenagers had 1 or 2 tunics of wool or linen, rough and patched until barely any original fabric remained. Shoes, if you had them, were crude leather, and in winter, your feet froze because socks were an invention yet to reach most. Girls often wore long skirts and headscarves, not for style, but because the church deemed it decent. Boys weren't much better off, with itchy trousers and tunics that barely kept out the cold. If you were a craftsman's apprentice, you might have a leather apron, but that was the fanciest you'd get. Superstitions also shaped a medieval teenager's life. Everything had meaning. A black cat crossing your path was a bad omen, and a crow cawing 3 times meant someone would die. Witches, they said, lurked in the woods, and adults warned you not to stray too far, lest you be snatched for a cauldron. Teenagers, with their natural curiosity, sometimes ventured out, only to run back at the sound of a twig snapping. Ghost stories, demons, and strange creatures were nighttime entertainment, told around a barely warm fire, and though you laughed to seem brave, deep down, you wondered if that shadow in the corner was just the wind or something far worse. If you were a boy with ambitions, you might dream of being a knight. The idea of riding a horse, wielding a sword, and saving damsels in distress was tempting, but the reality was less glamorous. Becoming a knight took years of training, first as a page, then a squire, and only noble sons had a real shot. Plus, armor was heavy, hot, and expensive, and battles were bloody and chaotic. Many teens dreaming of glory ended up as foot soldiers, marching with flimsy spears and praying not to be the first to fall. Girls, meanwhile, often fantasized about convent life, not always from devotion, but because it was one of the few ways to escape marriage and endless childbirth, though monastic life was strict and hardly thrilling. The weather was another relentless foe. Winters were brutal, and peasant huts, with mud walls and thatched roofs, let in wind and snow. Fire was your only ally, but firewood was scarce, and spending hours gathering branches in the forest was part of a teenager's routine. Summers, on the other hand, could be scorching, and working under the sun without protection was exhausting. Nature had no mercy, and teens quickly learned the world didn't stop for their complaints. A storm could ruin your roof, and lightning could burn your village, leaving you with nothing but the clothes on your back. Despite it all, medieval teenagers had admirable resilience. They learned to laugh at hardships, finding joy in small things: a song, a dance, a fresh loaf of bread. Community was their strength. Villages were small, and everyone knew each other. Neighbors helped rebuild a burned house, shared food in lean times, and celebrated together when there was cause. Teenagers, with their energy and humor, were often the life of these gatherings, telling bawdy jokes, out of the priest's earshot, of course, or inventing games to pass the time. Death was a constant presence, and teenagers faced it with a mix of fear and acceptance. Burying a sibling, friend, or parent was part of life, and church bells often rang for another funeral. Epidemics like the Black Death could wipe out entire villages, and teens watched loved ones fall, not understanding why. Yet they also learned to carry on, work harder, marry, and have kids to keep life going. Faith, for many, was a comfort, and the promise of a better heaven gave hope in a world that seemed designed to crush them. In short, being a teenager in the Middle Ages was a trial by fire. Between grueling work, hunger, disease, wars, and superstitions, every day was an adventure, not always by choice. But there were moments of light, laughter with friends, village festivals, stories told under the stars. Life was harsh, raw, and often short, but medieval teens found ways to survive, dream, and in their own way, leave their mark on a world that gave them no quarter. And if they made it to adulthood, they could look back and say, with a mix of pride and relief, that they'd survived one of history's most chilling eras, with little more than a tattered tunic, a crust of bread, and a sense of humor that, against all odds, never abandoned them.